are you? I hope everything is okay with you and your family in Brussels, and with all the pandemics and everything. I hope everything is fine with you.
Yes, we have reopened the terraces, and since they did so, it started to rain in Brussels, and it has been permanently for 2 weeks now. But I guess that was to be expected.
Oh, great. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Sven. This is a webinar, sadly not in person, but it is a webinar that was organized by our university, WAL, and our research center, OBSERVARE, with the National Defense Institute and with our CPA, the Portuguese Atlantic Committee, that is also present, João Rebelo, the director of the committee. It is a real pleasure to have Sven with us. Before we start, I would like to introduce you all Professor Sven Biscop, widely known, but still, Professor Dr. Sven Biscop was born in Belgium in 1976, read political sciences, and obtained his PhD at Ghent University, where today is a professor lecturing on Belgian and European foreign and defense policy and on the grand strategy of the European Union and the other great powers. At Egmont Institute, which he joined in 2002, he is the director of the Europe in the World program. In 2015, on the occasion of its 10th anniversary, Sven was made an honorary fellow of the European Security and Defense College, ESDC, an EU agency where he lectures for diplomats, military and officials from all EU member states, and where we usually meet before COVID, but where we actually met. He's also a regular speaker at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels and at the People's University of China in Beijing, where he is a senior research fellow. Sven further serves as professional fellow at United Nations University in Bruges and as senior research fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and of the Baltic Defense College. He is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in the United Kingdom and the Clausewitz Society in Germany, and chairs the jury of the annual Global Strategy PhD Prize awarded by Egmont and the ESDC. His latest book is entitled Grand Strategy in 10 Words, A Guide to Great Power Politics in the 21st Century, published by Bristol University Press in 2021. Sven has been honored with the Cross of Officer of the Order of the Crown of the Kingdom of Belgium and the Grand Decoration of Honor of the Republic of Austria. He lives in Brussels with his Taiwanese Belgian husband, Abaru, amidst a great many books, military paraphernalia, and chinoiserie. Unfortunately, they travel too often to keep a cat, although I believe that with the pandemics, you actually kept the cat, and you'll be traveling very soon, as we all hope. Sven, once again, thank you so much. It is a pleasure. The floor is yours. We are looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. Indeed, that bio was written before the pandemic, but we are optimists, so we think travel will resume. So we still didn't get the cat. What I want to talk about today, in the context of transatlantic relations, is defense relations, with a focus on NATO and the European Union, because there is a coincidence in time now. The EU has decided that it will write what it has called a strategic compass to be delivered by the middle of next year. And NATO will have a summit in Brussels this June, next month, where it will probably also decide to write a new strategic concept, also to be ready by the middle of next year. And so one could say that this coincidence in time perhaps creates an opportunity to have a certain division of tasks and a better coordination between the two. And that's what I would want to talk about, looking at three dimensions. The disadvantage of all these online meetings is, of course, that we cannot go for a perfect Portuguese meal afterwards, which I miss dearly. the advantage is that I can show you something, at least to try and make it entertaining. So we'll be talking about the EU and NATO. Here you see EU military stuff, the logo, and the counterpart is NATO, the logo. The military in the audience will recognize this as the sort of thing that you get when you meet any unit or give a lecture for them. You may see, it's also interesting to notice that at first glance, the NATO one is of course much bigger than the EU one, but you also notice that the actual center of it is the same size, right? There's just a lot more useless space around the NATO one. Perhaps that is indicative of something, perhaps not, who will say.
The core is what matters, so.
Back to my idea. Now, I must say by way of intro that for a long time I was opposed to the idea that one could come up with some sort of fixed division of labor between the EU and NATO, because the world is complex, and for sure, the day you fix the division of labor, the next day something will happen that doesn't fit into it, and then you're back to square one. But I've begun to change my mind. Why? Because the end result of not fixing the division of labor, at least a bit more clearly, is perennial suspicion and distrust between the two organizations. Basically, since the EU launched its own European security and defense policy in 1999, which we now call the Common Security and Defense Policy. So for more than 20 years already, there has been an ongoing beauty contest between the two. And it leads all the time to mutual paralysis, blocking of initiatives, and basically an overall suboptimal performance. So I have come to the conclusion that perhaps in order to at least get more output from these two organizations that consume a lot of resources, that it would be advisable to come up with a better definition of the respective roles. Not with the aim of making one or the other exclusively responsible for one area. And not to say that A is in charge of area X and then that B should stay totally out of it. I see it more as defining who takes the lead in which area, and then the other one can still act in it, but in support of the former organization, which is also a classic military principle. You have supporting and supported organizations or headquarters. So I have tried to think about this and come up with some sort of pragmatic division of labor, and I'll briefly go into the three dimensions that I see. Number one is classic defense, collective territorial defense. Now, the EU officially has adopted the objective of strategic autonomy in 2016 when it adopted the global strategy. In a way, this is not so new because the whole point of the creation of the ESDP back in 1999 was, of course, to create a certain degree of strategic autonomy. There are degrees of autonomy. You have to choose in which areas you want to be autonomous and to which extent. And the EU has always focused on crisis management. It wanted the autonomy to undertake its own expeditionary operations outside Europe. But increasingly, there is a fear, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe, that the ambition to strategic autonomy stretches into collective territorial defense. And there is a legal basis for that, because the Lisbon Treaty introduced Article 42.7, which creates a legal obligation for EU member states, if another EU member state is attacked, to render it all assistance in its power. However, the treaty qualifies that by saying that for those EU members who are also NATO allies, that NATO remains the primary forum to implement collective defense, plus it states that this guarantee does not detract from what it calls the specific nature of the defense policies of certain member states. That's EU jargon for meaning neutral states. So the reality is 42.7 has basically not been implemented. There is no defense planning in the EU. There is no headquarters. The EU is not organizing for collective territorial defense. And yet the suspicion lingers. So I would say that here our message should be very clear. NATO should remain the leading organization in collective territorial defense, certainly for the time being. And thus, one should dispel once and for all the big suspicion that exists of the EU ambition in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, also in the United States. Now, within that NATO role, though, I think the Europeans should do more, because it's clear that the alliance is out of balance. Too much is done by the United States and too little by the Europeans. In my view, this is important, though, because the grand strategy of the United States is shifting. Ever since Obama already, the focus of US strategic attention has shifted to Asia and to China. And for the Americans, and this cuts across party lines, the number one priority is now their competition or even rivalry with China. This means, in very simple terms, that for the first time since the Second World War, Europe is now a secondary theater for the Americans. And the primary theater is Asia. That does not mean that they will abandon us. For sure, a stable and prosperous Europe remains an important interest of the United States, but it does mean that their order of priorities has changed. And this means, hypothetically, that if the US were engaged in a crisis in Asia, that would get priority over a simultaneous crisis in Europe. In other words, if there were two crises at the same time, the Europeans would have to man the first line of defense themselves. The American reinforcements would still come, but they may come later and in smaller numbers than we have hitherto planned for. So the first line of defense really, and I'm talking conventional defense, I leave aside the nuclear dimension, but the first line of conventional defense ought to be European. In a way, it is European, because except for the small number of American combat troops in NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and Poland, all the American troops in Europe, they are basically logistics troops, right? So the first line of defense is already European, but we ought to make it stronger. I think the message that the Europeans should send to any potential aggressor is to say, look, even if there were not a single American soldier in Europe, you could still not make a blitzkrieg against us. You could not fight and win a short, sharp war. It would always you would grind down into a war of attrition, and we would keep fighting until the Americans would come. So better not start it. That means, I think, that of the conventional forces that the NATO defense planning process requires, half should be European. Then the alliance would be in balance, even though, as I said, it remains organized collective territorial defense by NATO. Now, there is another side to collective territorial defense, which is defense against all non-military threats, which we now summarize under the very broad, so broad that it's almost useless, heading of hybrid threats. Hybrid threats range very broadly, right? They start with basically legal activities, outside powers trying to gain influence in Europe by organizing events, inviting academics for lunch, but it goes quickly into illegal activities such as corrupting people, espionage, hacking, sabotage, all sorts of subversion, fake news, propaganda, disinformation, all sorts of coercion, right? Using economic or military blackmail to force a state to change its decisions, and in the end, so all non-military threats. Here, I think the EU should take the lead, not NATO. NATO should play a supporting role. Of course, resilience, the defense against these hybrid threats, is also very important for the alliance. The alliance has developed a set of benchmarks, 7 benchmarks for resilience. But in the end, a lot of resilience has to do with the economy, right? How does Europe profile itself these days vis-a-vis other great powers? Mostly by instrumentalizing its domestic competences. Who is allowed to enter the European single market? In which area? Who can invest? Who cannot invest? Which subsidies are we allowed? What is critical infrastructure? Who can invest it and who not? Who can own it? Those decisions have to be European decisions. It would be unacceptable that NATO or the United States, through NATO, decides who can or who cannot invest in the single market. That has to be an EU decision. So I think in this broad area of resilience, the EU is much better placed and ought to be the leading actor with NATO in a supporting role. And NATO can certainly develop benchmarks and standards, but they should not, in my view, go against EU rules and regulations. It also follows, I think, from this, if I say that NATO takes the lead in collective defense against military threats, then NATO should not take the lead in dealing with China. Because China, I think, is a mainstream view in Europe, is not primarily a military issue. It's a foreign policy issue, and it's an economic issue. And of course, NATO allies must be able to talk about China. It's obvious that NATO allies must be able to discuss everything that they think is important for their defense. But that doesn't mean that the NATO apparatus should then develop a policy on all of these items, right? And that's, I think, the confusion that often exists when we talk about NATO. NATO is an exceptional alliance because it's a very institutionalized alliance, right? There's the headquarters, the political headquarters here in Brussels. Then there's the standing command structure with the supreme headquarters also in Belgium, in Mons. Other alliances don't have that, right? Think of the US-Japan alliance or the US-Australia alliance. There is no big bureaucracy. So if the US and Australia discuss China, then Australia for its part, the US for its part, implement policy. But if NATO discusses China, then there's always the idea, oh no, the headquarters has to create a new branch, hire new people, and begin to develop all kinds of papers. Only then after a while to discover that NATO, the bureaucracy actually can do nothing about China because it's a foreign policy issue and an economic policy issue for which NATO has neither the competences nor the authority or the expertise. So I think clearly here NATO should play the supporting role. The NATO administration should monitor Chinese defense to the extent and policy to the extent that it has an impact on NATO defense, but setting strategy on China, that's for the EU on our side of the Atlantic Ocean, and of course for Washington and Canberra on the other side of the Atlantic. And it is interesting to see that there was a NATO defense foreign ministers meeting a few weeks ago in Brussels, and they issued a very short communique. That's a positive development, I think. NATO and EU communiques always tend to be way too long, and the academics have to read all of that. And it didn't mention China. That's the interesting part. It mentioned Russia, it mentioned authoritarian powers, but not China. But instead, after the NATO meeting, US Secretary of State Blinken met with the EU High Representative, Josep Borrell. They announced the beginning of an EU-US dialogue on China. So I think this is also an part of this, that the Americans should realize if they want to discuss with Europeans, not all topics have to be channeled through NATO. On many issues, it's actually much more productive to talk directly with the EU because that's where the budget is, or that's where the competence is. So this was my first dimension: collective defense against classic military threats. NATO in the lead, against hybrid threats, the EU in the lead, in my view. Second dimension is then expeditionary operations or all military operations outside European territory. Here, I think that on the European side, the EU should be in the lead. Why? Because the whole NATO apparatus, NATO defense planning, has been configured since 1949 to look to the east. The point was to deter first the Soviet Union and now to deter Russia. And I think for NATO, the South will always be a sideshow. And from time to time, the alliance pretends that it cares about the South because, of course, member states like Portugal and Spain and France and Italy, they are very much concerned, much more directly than others, by security on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. And so to please those allies, NATO pretends that it does things for the South, but in the end, it is just paying lip service to that. The main NATO effort will always be the East. Whereas for the EU, it's the other way around. If you want to deter Russia, and if you would ever arrive at an Article 5 scenario against Russia, that would obviously be something to be dealt with together with North American allies. So that would be a NATO issue. Whereas in the South, it directly concerns the EU a lot more. And there is, but the situation, the problem is also much more complex, right? In the South, it's not about deterring another great power. In the South, the military instrument is not the primary instrument, actually. In the South, we're facing a very complex situation that requires the magic comprehensive or integrated approach of a carefully calibrated political, economic and military approach, which I think the EU is much better placed to deliver than NATO. So I would say, let the EU take the lead for crisis management operations in the south, and let NATO play only the supporting role. Here too, one of the reasons is that it's clear that the United States is less and less interested in crisis management on the southern flank of Europe. And they support us when we act, for example, in the Sahel, but if we wouldn't act, they would not act in our place. And this is, I think, a very important lesson for us, that nobody will defend the European interest in our place. Everybody has to defend their own interest. Even in an alliance, you have to stand up for your own interest. So that's why I think the EU should take the lead in the south. However, this has some implications, and I think the most important implication is that the EU, as EU, we need to think a lot more carefully about why do we do interventions actually. And for me, this is one of the main questions perhaps that the EU's new document, the Strategic Compass, should address. In which scenarios, can we legitimately consider the use of force by the European Union? This is not so clear now in an EU context. If you read the 2016 EU Global Strategy, it seems to say that the point of crisis management is to protect the citizens of other countries, when they are threatened by war or humanitarian crisis. But if you look at the practice of what we do as Europeans, well, that's not primarily why we intervene. We don't intervene to protect someone else's people. We intervene to protect our own people, of course. And we intervene to protect our own interests. So in my view, we should arrive at a strategy that is much more reticent to consider direct military intervention on the southern flank. In my view, we must state very clearly that we will only consider direct military intervention if our own vital interests are directly at stake. For example, if a war on the southern flank threatens to spill over to EU territory, or if it threatens to generate terrorism against our territory, if it threatens our connectivity, think of the classic blocking of the Suez Canal, or if it generates such a stream of refugees that can only be managed by ending the war. In those scenarios, I think it is legitimate to consider the use of force if no other options can work, which means that in all other scenarios, we should not intervene directly. It doesn't mean we do nothing. It doesn't mean we don't have to care, but that we use political instruments, economic instruments, or indirect military instruments. For example, to enforce an arms embargo, maybe enforce a no-fly zone. But if our own interests are not at stake, I think we should not directly intervene. The Libyan crisis is a classic example of that. I'll be very honest, at the time of the Libyan intervention, 2012, or 2011 already, I was very much in favor of that. But with hindsight, which is always easy, I think it was a big mistake, because in the end, what was at stake for us in Libya? What would have happened for our security if we had not intervened in the Libyan civil war? I would say nothing whatsoever. The reasons why we intervened were humanitarian. They were also political, because we had reacted very slowly to the ousting of the presidents of Tunisia and Egypt, the Arab Spring, and we wanted to show in Libya that we were on the good side, so to say. But actually, our vital interests were not at stake there. We did intervene, and you all know the consequences. Libya is still in a civil war. We also generated a massive refugee and migration issue. We then helped in provoking another civil war in Syria, and we certainly directly contributed to the escalation of the war in Mali. Result, we had to intervene again in Mali, and we're still there. We also had to intervene in the end in Iraq and Syria because of ISIS, and we had to intervene militarily in the Mediterranean because of the refugee and migration crisis. Had we stayed out of Libya, perhaps some of these other wars would have happened too, but perhaps not, or they would not have grown to the scale that we see today. So it is, of course, in a way, it seems very harsh to say, but it's a very realpolitik approach. If your interests are not directly at stake, don't consider direct military intervention. Now, that said, we need to find a balance, because what is new in our context is that although there is no other great power located there, like we have Russia in the east, the other great powers are all present there, right? Russia is there in Libya, for example. China is there, but also regional powers such as Turkey, the Gulf states, and so on and so forth. In other words, if we leave a void somewhere, others will immediately move in. We've clearly seen that in Libya, where then after the air campaign, basically we dropped Libya and we sort of expected the United Nations to take care of it, and we just looked away. So this is new. If we are not present on our southern flank, other powers will move in, including in the military field, and this is a danger to us. We could not afford that another power gains such influence in a neighboring country that it would then direct that country away from our interest. So we have to find a balancing act. We have to be very reticent to direct military intervention, but I do think that in our southern neighborhood, we probably need a permanent or semi-permanent indirect military presence, meaning that we build a presence through capacity building and training missions in order to maintain the minimum footprint that gains us influence, that makes sure that other powers don't gain undue influence, but with the overall purpose always of helping the local states to be able to take care of their own security problems rather than stepping in instead of them. And that's difficult. As we see in Mali, we've been there for 8 years now, unsuccessfully, obviously, because if it were successful, we would already have left. And so we cannot leave, but at the same time, it seems that our current involvement is at too large a scale, and it can go on forever like this. So somehow we are still searching for this balance. But I think this is a really important debate to have among the Europeans, preferably through the EU. So that was my second point. The EU should be in the lead, in my view, in non-Article 5 operations on the southern flank. That, of course, includes not just army; it also includes maritime security. It also includes the air. Then we can discuss how far south the southern flank goes. Right? The EU global strategy actually says it goes all the way to Central Africa. But as you know, certainly in Portugal, we are very much aware that for the moment there is great trouble in Mozambique, and that is also on the EU agenda. So that then is to be decided how far it is in our interest to go. Brings me to my third point, and I can pick up the question by Pedro about the fixed percentage of GDP. Then this is about capabilities. So defense planning and capability development. For the moment, we have two processes that run in parallel. The NATO defense planning process, NDPP on the one hand. Then on the EU side, you have, well, actually two EU processes, because nothing is ever simple. You have the EU headline goal process, and you have the capability development plan. The most detailed one is, of course, the NDPP, which translates NATO's overall military needs into targets for every individual ally. Binding targets, but you, of course, negotiate those binding targets yourself. It's not just a one-way street. And if you don't meet them, there is trouble. And there's a careful assessment, and you have to defend them. But in the end, if you don't meet them, you don't meet them. So even NATO cannot force a member state to do something that it doesn't want to do, but it's definitely uncomfortable. As a Belgian, I can say that if you don't meet your NATO targets. On the EU side, there's this kind of double process, the headline goal that focuses on the more, let's say, short to medium term needs of crisis management operations, and the capability development plan that looks at the medium to long term needs, including technology, defense industry, and so on and so forth. Those also generate priorities, but they do not translate into individual targets. The EU only sets collective targets, and they are not binding. The result is easy to predict. Most EU member states just ignore the headline goal in the capability development plan. Even in Belgium, I think defense planners, when they have to look at national defense planning, this is what comes last. And when you're last on the list, the money has been allocated, so there is nothing for you. So basically, the NDPP is what drives national defense planning, in addition, of course, to specific national needs. Now, you could say, fine, we could just ditch the EU part of this, but this would not be a solution either, because we need for two reasons actually. One, the NATO defense planning process, of course, does not take into account the EU need for strategic autonomy. If the EU wants to be able to take the lead in non-Article 5 operations in the southern flank, the EU member states need specific capabilities, specifically strategic enablers, which now we don't have. They are mostly American. At the scale of NATO, this doesn't matter so much, because then NATO, US, of course, in NATO, so it means the strategic enablers are there. If you take only the Europeans, the strategic enablers are not there. So you need the EU to decide a degree of strategic autonomy. What is it that we want to be able to do alone on our southern flank, and how many enablers does that require? And that ought to be included then in the NATO defense planning process. The other reason why we need the EU dimension is that NATO sets individual targets, but in many capability areas, most European allies have become too small to meet those areas. You can say that Belgium has a target for air-to-air refueling, but in a way, it's not cost-effective to do that. We are too small to develop our own Belgian air-to-air refueling capacity, and this goes actually for many areas. In other words, in many areas, you need collective solutions to which individual countries contribute. So my view here is that the EU and NATO, that they should somehow interlink their two processes. You don't need an EU DPP alongside the NDPP. What I think is, you could say we keep the NDPP, but you build in an EU dimension into it. In between the NATO level as a whole and the individual state level, you create a collective EU/European levels aimed at the NATO allies who are EU member states, plus the other EU member states who are all partners of NATO, except for Cyprus, plus any other European ally that would want to associate with it, such as Norway. And you say, look, for this group of countries, we define a number of collective binding targets that include the strategic enablers that the Europeans need to be strategically autonomous in terms of crisis management operations. And then the best way to meet those targets is by making use of the EU tools. And so became the question about percentage of GDP. I think that the best criterion is not how much do you spend on defense, but which capabilities do you put into the field. And the 2% of GDP is very artificial. You see it everywhere now across Europe. Suddenly everybody is doing better, not because we're spending more, but because the GDP has fallen as a result of the Corona crisis. That shows you immediately how artificial this benchmark is. If you do want the benchmark, I think what's much more important is, and it's a NATO and an EU benchmark, that however much you spend, 20% of it should be on investment. And I think that forces many member states anyway to increase their defense budget, because if you spend 2/3 or more on salaries, as many do, and of course salaries cannot be lowered, quite the contrary, they ought to be higher in many places, well, then the only way to reach the 20% investment is by increasing the budget. So I think that's much more important. So the new development here is that the EU has now created important new instruments, PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, plus the European Defence Fund, the EDF. And I think those are the best tools that we have to actually meet NATO targets by making use of EU instruments. So that also requires sort of breaking through the stovepipes, right? NATO must accept, NATO organization, that actually the best way to meet NATO targets in many areas will be by making use of EU instruments. And the EU administration has to accept that these EU instruments don't just serve EU needs, the needs of CSDP. In fact, they are most effective and cost effective if they look at the armed forces of the EU member states in their entirety, taking their total scope in order to maximize effects of scale and synergies, and to build, that's the aim of PESCO, a single comprehensive full spectrum force package. PESCO, permanent and structured cooperation. Once cooperation is permanent and structured, it means that it is integration. Actually, that in my view is the real difference. PESCO means integration of the armed forces of the EU member states. That's a quantum leap that we should make. To wrap up and taking a question from Joanna by way of conclusion, will the strategic compass change all of this, or will it just be another document? Sorry, that's a question of Mafalda that I was taking.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Will it just be another piece of paper? Well, it's early to say. I'm trying to follow this discussion as closely as I can. I mean, on the face of it, it is an opportunity, right? That we are writing a strategic compass and a strategic concept at the same time. And in an ideal world, you could use this opportunity to coordinate and deconflict between the two, and maybe even to have some sort of delineation of roles. The reality is that it's already become very competitive. That certainly on the NATO side, the NATO administration seems to regard the strategic compass process as a threat rather than an opportunity. And there's a classic fear that if the Europeans would define their position in the EU first, that then they would come with a single voice to NATO. And that's what the US, the UK, and the NATO administration don't like. Even though, if you think about it, that this would only be logical. It's what the EU does anywhere, that in addition to member states, the EU as such speaks in the United Nations, in the OSCE and so on, but not in NATO. But it would only be logical. So in reality, it's already a competitive and rather tense process between the two organizations, this compass and the concept. Now, the compass per se, there are a load of non-papers that have been issued by member states, and the discussions are ongoing. And still, though, it remains unclear what the compass actually is. And already the name gives you an indication that the EU is still somewhat uncomfortable to talk about defense. I read the compass as basically a defense strategy for the EU. That the global strategy is the equivalent of a national security strategy, and the strategic compass is then the equivalent of a defense strategy under that overall strategy. But we are not allowed to call it that, right? So we come up with this new word, a strategic compass, which, yeah, basically obfuscates and it doesn't tell you what it is. There is a clear intention to have an operational document, a document that can be implemented. As people like to say, we cannot write a strategic compass that then in turn needs an action plan, because then we will just keep on writing documents. Indeed, it's already the second document, if you think about it. Because in 2016, in June, we adopted the global strategy. Now, in November, the EU adopted the implementation plan on security and defense. So the translation of the global strategy in the field of defense. I don't know if anybody in the audience remembers this document or has ever heard of it. Don't feel ashamed if you haven't, because it's already been totally forgotten. Even though supposedly this was to be the central implementing document. So in a way, the strategic compass is the second attempt already to do better and implement our grand strategy, the global strategy in the field of defense. So it's too early to say, but the discussions are difficult. And I noticed that time and again, the discussion falls back on talks about procedures and institutions. But that is just not enough, right? Tinkering with the procedures and the institutions will not do it. We need capabilities and we need the will to intervene when we need to intervene. And we can, of course, not create that by decree, but it is the core of it. So my final word is that I remain an optimist, but a cautious optimist. I've been writing on European defense since I was a master's student, which means since 1998 already. And I have written many articles in which I proclaimed the great breakthrough in European defense, only then to realize that it was not quite a breakthrough yet. So I remain cautiously optimistic. Voila, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to all your questions. If I'm allowed a little advertising, I will put my upcoming book in the chat, Grand Strategy in 10 Words. It will be out in a couple of... Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven.